My parents excluded my children to a folding table at Christmas dinner, so I confronted their favoritism, reclaimed their place, and forged a new family legacy. I never imagined a single notification could fracture my world before sunrise. My name's Laura Martinez, I'm 38, and I live in a modest suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where December air bites through even the thickest coat. At 5:15 a.m., I slipped out the back door, packed turkey sandwich lunches in foil for the kids, and headed across town to my late shift at St. Agnes Hospital. My promotion to head nurse came with enough overtime to cover our holiday expenses, and a promise of homemade Christmas cookies waiting on the counter when I got home. The ER was unrelenting. I guided new interns through chest pain assessments, comforted jittery parents in the waiting room, and charted vitals until my pen cramped. Still, a quiet joy kept me steady. Tonight's shift would fund those cookies, the very ones my 6-year-old Emma calls Santa's surprise. My heart felt full knowing I'd walk in with sweet-smelling treats and big hugs. At 8:02 p.m., fatigue hit. I ducked into the break room, wrapping my fingers around a lukewarm cup of coffee. My phone buzzed in my pocket, only 1% battery, of course. I swiped awake and froze. A notification from my sister. New photos tagged at Mom and Dad's place. Dozens of images. I scrolled with trembling thumbs. There they were, Emma and Jake, 8, sitting at a small card table in the far corner of our dining room, their faces bright in festive sweaters. But beyond their table, under our parents' chandelier, a grand spread. Roasted duck, scalloped potatoes, crystal wine glasses, laughter I couldn't hear but could almost taste. Hidden in the shadows, my children looked out of place like ornaments unwillingly stuck on the edges of someone else's tree. A cold emptiness bloomed in my chest. Why wasn't I invited? How long had this been brewing? My breaths came shallow, hot tears stinging behind my glasses. I tapped the first photo, Emma's forced smile. I tapped the second, Jake's sideways glance. Image after image, every click pressed betrayal deeper. I tried to steady myself. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they'd planned to surprise me later. My thumb hovered over the call button for my mother. No, I couldn't trust the calm in my voice. Instead, I texted my sister. What's going on? Why are they having Christmas without us? Sent. No reply. My break time vanished. My mind replayed every holiday past where I fell short as a daughter, as a mother. I pictured my kids eagerly telling me about new toys or apple cider, only to have it filtered through someone else's version of family. The injustice burned like frostbite. I shoved the phone into my coat pocket and stormed back into the corridor, eyes stinging with tears I refused to shed in scrubs. Each step toward the nurse's station felt heavy, as though the tiles themselves knew my betrayal. I slapped on my mask and forced a smile at a patient who asked about the weather. Snow's coming. I lied, but inside an avalanche was already in motion. Tonight I promised myself I'm not going to let this slide. I'll confront them. I'll demand answers. The thought was a drumbeat in my skull as I clocked back in, and that's when another notification lit up the screen, a video clip of my children, reaching for cookies that never made it their way. Their little hands hovering, unsure whether to take or to wait. And just like that, I felt something break. What I would do next would change everything. The break room's fluorescent lights buzzed as I stared down at my phone, heart racing faster than I'd ever raced for an ER code. My shift clipboard lay forgotten on the table, half-filled scribbles of vitals and Roman for drips. I replayed the images of Emma and Jake huddled at that tiny card table, their eyes gleaming with forced cheer under my parents' chandelier. My coffee went cold between my shaking fingers. I thumbed out a text to my sister. Hey, do you know why Mom and Dad threw a Christmas dinner without telling us? And waited, staring at the clock on the wall as if time might rush the reply. Nothing. I tried her again, then my mother, Mom, what's going on? Why weren't we invited? No blue ticks, no read receipts. My chest tightened. I hit call on Mom's number, straight to voicemail. I stared at the phone, willing it to buzz back to life with an explanation, an apology. Anything? When I heard the beep, I hung up before she could even start a greeting. My nurse's break ended an hour ago, but I couldn't go back to charts and bedpans. Tears stung behind my mask as I shoved past the swinging door and out into the cold hallway. I ripped off my badge and dumped my coat over my scrubs, grabbing gloves and mask like battle armor. I didn't wait for permission or care that I left a shift short. Nothing mattered but confronting this betrayal. Minneapolis streets were dusted with fresh snow, each flake catching the streetlights like 1,000 tiny accusations. I slammed the car door, slid behind the wheel, and peeled away from the hospital parking lot, scaring off a late shift security guard with my abrupt U-turn. My breath fogged the windows. I flicked the wipers on high. Every red light felt like another judgment. You're not family. You're not welcome. I wanted to slam the steering wheel, scream until my voice cracked, but I only pressed harder on the accelerator. As I drove north, memories pulsed in time with the headlights flicker. My father's disapproving nod when I got third place in the school play, Mom's sigh when I brought home a B+, the perpetual shadow of my brother's achievements. Now my kids, my heart, were back there, hidden behind that shabby table. I clenched the wheel until my knuckles went white, whispering their names to myself like a prayer. Emma's laugh, Jake's grin, how could anyone exclude them? The address came into view, the familiar clapboard house where I grew up, its windows aglow with that same warm light I'd once thought cocooned me. The driveway was empty, the snow untrodden like my parents were still inside, oblivious to the storm they'd ignited. My chest ached with every passing second. I needed answers, needed to shield my children from this pain. I shifted into park, unbuckled my seatbelt, and braced myself against the door. I grabbed my phone again, no new messages, and forced myself to step into the chill. The porch light flickered on as I approached the door, each breath a cloud in the frosty air. I stared at the wreath on the door, its holly berries mocking me with festive cheer. My hand hovered over the doorbell. Behind it, laughter spilled out, my children's laughter, unguarded and pure. My heart seized. I closed my eyes, inhaled the cold December night, and rang the bell. My breath hitched the moment the door swung open, frosting the air between us like shattered glass. I stood on the worn welcome mat of my childhood home, Minneapolis snow sifting through my boots, staring up at my mother's startled face and my father's pinched, polite smile behind her. "Mom," I said, voice tight as iron, "why did you seat my kids like servants?" Her eyes widened. For a heartbeat, she seemed genuinely puzzled. Then guilt. Wordless apology flickered across her lips, but no sound followed. Behind her, my father shifted his weight, folding his arms as if bracing for impact. I didn't think," she began, but I cut her off. You didn't think Emma and Jake deserved to sit at the same table as everyone else." I couldn't keep the tremor from my voice. "They're my children, your grandchildren." My mother swallowed, then found her voice. "Honey, it's not like that. You ran out of chairs. Space is tight in here." "Ran out of chairs?" I echoed, stepping inside so hard the screen door banged behind me. My gloved hand left a smear on its frame. "You made room for crystal wine glasses, for heirloom china for Aunt Karen and her new husband. But for my kids, you brought out a folding table and an old tablecloth. That's your excuse." My father cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the floor. When he looked up, I saw the practiced calm in his gaze, the calm that always came when you were in trouble, but he didn't want to admit it. "Laura, traditions are—" "Your traditions," I said, voice aching, "don't include us." I kicked off my snow-flecked boots. The foyer felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closing in with every heartbeat. "You've always favored him." I spat, picturing my older brother's place at the head of every celebration I wasn't even invited to. "Now you've done it to my kids." My mother's shoulders sagged. She stared at her hands, knuckles pale, words tangling on her tongue. My father shifted again, jaw clenched, playing silent referee in a game he'd forgotten how to win. I could see it in their faces, the old-world pride that had driven them to cherish order and hierarchy above empathy. That rigidity had ruled my childhood, carving deep lines of inadequacy into my heart. And now it threatened to do the same to Emma and Jake. I closed my eyes, swallowing a sob that caught like ice in my throat. "I get it," I whispered. "You don't know how to change." My voice cracked on the last word, but they didn't deserve this. I glanced past them toward the living room's soft glow and heard muffled laughter, my children's laughter like betrayal echoing through the walls. My mother stepped forward, her voice low. "Laura, maybe if you didn't work so much." Her words hit me like a punch. My chest tightened so sharply, I thought I'd snap in two. I'd missed birthdays, sure, late shifts had stolen some of my time, but I'd always been there to tuck them in, read them stories, catch their nightmares. My promotion kept our house afloat. My promotion gave us the chance to build memories that mattered. And yet here I was accused of absence while they were being hidden in plain sight. I clenched my fists, realizing I was shaking. "This isn't about how often I'm here," I shot back. "It's about respect. It's about love. I think tradition means excluding the ones you should cherish most." My father's forced smile cracked. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The foyer seemed to shrink further, until it was just the four of us trapped in a silence thicker than any winter frost. I took a step back, letting the tension pull at me like an undertow. My children's laughter filtered through the door again, innocent, unaware. My heart constricted. I inhaled deeply, feeling my own resolve harden. "I'm not leaving until you make this right," I said, voice low, unwavering. "Not until my kids have their place at your table." Behind me, the front door closed with a soft click, but what happened next, I couldn't shake the fear that behind my parents' silence was something they still refused to admit. The dining room's glow seeped into the foyer, painting everything gold, and I hated it. My parents stood pressed together near the front door, arms crossed as though they could carve space in the air to keep me out. Behind them, the main table was a masterpiece. Gleaming silver platters of duck confit, bowls of scalloped potatoes crowned with melted Gruyere, crystal wine glasses dangling like prisms. Laughter rippled through the room, warm as summer, but it felt like ice against my skin. I forced myself past them, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I stood at the edge of the room, gaze drifting to the empty card table in the corner, the one where Emma and Jake had sat like afterthoughts. The cloth was still draped crookedly over the folding legs, a silent monument to their dismissal. My mother cleared her throat. "Laura, But I wasn't listening to her excuses. My mind skittered back to 6th grade, and my teacher called me for extra help after school, and I showed up with my workbook only to find Dad in the front row, applauding my brother's piano recital. I remembered standing in the wings, cheeks flaming, wondering why no one had reserved a seat for me. I remembered the sting of being drafted last for any team. "Sorry, Laura, we need an even number," they'd say, until I became single by default. I remembered the time I brought home a ribbon for science fair and watched it go unused on the shelf, replaced by larger trophies for every little thing my brother did. I closed my eyes, the present pressing in like a weight. Folding table, the mismatched chairs, they weren't just a lack of furniture. They were a catalog of all the ways my parents had seen me as less over and over, and now they did the same to my children. My shoulders sagged as I spoke, voice low. "This isn't just about chairs." I turned to my parents, who stared back at me with rigid faces. "It's about the message you're sending, that they belong in the shadows, that they're not worthy of sitting with the rest of us." My father's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. My mother's hands trembled at her sides, the careful apology she'd practiced lost somewhere between shame and stubborn pride. I stepped closer to the card table. Snow still clung to one corner of its plastic top, a reminder of how hastily they'd pulled it from storage. I reached down and smoothed the cloth with a deliberate sweep, as though flattening every old grievance into the fabric. "They're my children," I said. "Your grandchildren. You deserve your best, every bit of it." A flicker of something regret maybe passed over my mother's face. She looked away, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize. You didn't realize." I shook my head, sorrow curdling into anger. "That you could hurt them the same way you hurt me. That's exactly what happened." Behind me, voices hushed. I glanced around. Aunts and uncles exchanged uneasy glances. Cousins poked each other wide-eyed. Grandeur of the table felt distilled into a single truth. No matter how beautiful the setting, the heart of the gathering was broken. I took a breath, feeling tears burn at the backs of my eyes. "I know the pull of tradition. I know how hard it is to change old habits." My tone softened. "But tradition doesn't mean cruelty. You taught me to care for the injured in the ER. Don't leave anyone behind. Why treat my children any differently?" My father finally met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Hum of conversation had nearly died out. The tension was so thick you could stir it with a spoon. My mother stepped forward, eyes glistening. She reached for my hand, then hesitated as though the very touch would shatter something. I held my breath, waiting. In that moment, the gourmet feast, the ornate china, even the centuries of family custom seemed utterly hollow if they couldn't hold space for every heart in the room. "What will you do?" my father asked, voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I looked from him to my mother, then back to the empty card table. I could feel the echoes of every slight I'd ever carried. "I'll stay," I said, "but I won't let history repeat itself." My words were quiet, but they filled the room, and somewhere in the hush that followed, I sensed the first crack in their armor, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for something different. I backed out of the dining room and into the narrow hallway, its walls lined with faded family photos, weddings and graduations, all with me in the background. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in each step. I closed the front door behind me, muffling the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. The hallway light flickered, casting long shadows. I leaned against the wall, sliding down until I sat on the edge of the threadbare runner. My breaths came in ragged gasps, anger, grief, and a fierce protectiveness roiling inside me like a storm trapped beneath glass. I pressed, my palm to the cool banister, grounding myself against the tremor in my limbs. Through the crack beneath the door, I heard footsteps. My mother's shuffling departure from the dining room to the living room, my father's hesitant sigh. Laughter, soft, uncertain, drifted from the next room. My children, still caught in the afterglow of dessert, unaware of the battle just fought on their behalf, closed my eyes, conjuring their faces. Emma's puzzled gaze when she first spotted that lonely card table, Jake's brave little smile as he tried to join in. My chest tightened. My children deserved more than half-hearted apologies and dusty traditions. They deserved to feel seen. A part of me screamed to burst back into the dining room, scoop them up, and march them triumphantly to the main table. Another part whispered patience. Let them feel this moment's weight. Their discomfort sparked reflection. I weighed my fury against my grief and realized I needed strategy more than spectacle. I stood, dusting snow from my coat where it had fallen when I stormed in. I pressed my hand to the cold window pane, watching the snow swirl under the porch light. The quiet of the storm outside mirrored the tension inside me, silent, contained, yet impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed in my pocket, my husband's name lighting up the screen. Considered calling him to fetch the kids and leave this house behind forever. But then I pictured the questions they'd ask in the car. Why did Grandma and Grandpa make us sit over there? And I knew running away wouldn't answer anything. It would only let my parents' actions go unchallenged. I slipped my phone back and inhaled a slow, measured breath. This wasn't a moment for tears or tantrums or midnight rescues. It was a moment for resolve. I needed to gather my strength, marshal my calm, and choose the moment that would truly demand their respect. I smoothed my skirt, squared my shoulders, and listened as the storm outside settled into a low whisper. Somewhere beyond that door, my family awaited my next move, ambivalent, uneasy, changed. I pressed my ear against the door, heart thundering. The hush inside felt like the eye of a hurricane, ominous, pregnant with possibility. And in that silence, I knew exactly what I would do next. I slipped into the dining room just as the last plates were being cleared. The clink of china and soft scrape of chair legs filled the hush that had settled after my confrontation. My parents hovered by the buffet, father's shoulders tight, mother's eyes wide with something between guilt and surprise. Cousins and aunts exchanged glances, unsure whether to speak or pretend nothing had happened. My children sat huddled at the folding table in the corner, Emma's foot nervously tapping the metal leg, Jake twisting his napkin into tiny knots. Their sweaters were dusted with falling crumbs. Cookies. I realized my homemade cookies untouched. My chest clenched. Here was my chance. I inhaled, tasting the residual sweetness of peppermint bark on the air, and stood tall. "Emma, Jake," I said, voice calm but ringing through the room. Heads turned as my children rose slowly, uncertainty clouding their eyes. They looked at me first, then at the main table, and I offered a small, confident smile. "Come join us," I continued, gesturing to the empty seats between me and my father. My parents stiffened, faces blanching. The others watched in silence, breaths held. Emma let go of the napkin, her shoulders straightening. Jake gave me a quick, hopeful glance before stepping across the room. I pulled out chairs for them as everyone watched. My mother's breath caught, my father's jaw clenched. I placed each child's plate on the fine china, a pattern of holly and berries their little hands once could only dream of touching. The grandchildren rose and followed, and murmurs rippled around us like wind through bare trees. Emma slid into the seat next to me. Jake sat on my other side. I slipped an arm around each of them, my own shield. I looked up at my parents. Their forced composure cracked under my gaze. No one spoke for a moment. The grand display of dishes now seemed absurd without the two people it had been meant to exclude. I glanced down at Emma's face. She was smiling, but I saw the flicker of hurt beneath. Jake's knuckles whitened on the tablecloth. I leaned forward, voice soft but steady. "They belong here," I said. My mother's lips trembled. My father's eyes darted away. Around us, a cousin cleared her throat and began gathering stray napkins, the room's tension winding tighter. Aunt Karen swallowed, then reached over to lift a crystal glass. "To family," she said in a shaky voice, raising it just above the table's center. "Together." The glass rattled against her thumb before she set it down again, breath unsteady. I looked at my children, Emma's bright eyes shining back at me, Jake's small smile growing real. I placed my right hand over Emma's and my left over Jake's. "Together," I whispered. At that moment, Grandma, my mother, stepped forward. She hesitated, then gently laid a hand on Emma's shoulder. The warmth of her touch was overdue, but it resonated across the table. My father's gaze softened as he reached out, almost tentatively, toward Jake's hand. The gesture was small, but it crackled through the quiet like the first ember of a long dormant fire. No words were needed. The room held its breath, watching as the two smallest members of our family took their place among us. And in that hush, I felt something shift, the weight of old slights lifting, if only for a moment. But I also knew the work wasn't done. Tradition could be rewritten, but only if they remembered this night. I straightened in my seat, shoulders back, eyes fixed on the place settings now shared by every generation at once. And as the first real conversation, tentative, apologetic, hopeful, began to bloom around us, I realized this silent, deliberate act of inclusion was only the beginning. What came next would define us all. I slipped into the dining room just as the last plates were being cleared. Clink of china and soft scrape of chair legs filled the hush that had settled after my confrontation. My parents hovered by the buffet, father's shoulders tight, mother's eyes wide, with something between guilt and surprise. Cousins and aunts exchanged glances, unsure whether to speak or pretend nothing had happened. My children sat huddled at the folding table in the corner, Emma's foot nervously tapping the metal leg, Jake twisting his napkin into tiny knots. Her sweaters were dusted with falling crumbs. Cookies. I realized my homemade cookies untouched. My chest clenched. Here was my chance. I inhaled, tasting the residual sweetness of peppermint bark on the air, and stood tall. "Emma, Jake," I said, voice calm but ringing through the room. Heads turned as my children rose slowly, uncertainty clouding their eyes. They looked at me first, then at the main table, and I offered a small, confident smile. "Come join us," I continued, gesturing to the empty seats between me and my father. My parents stiffened, faces blanching. The others watched in silence, breaths held. Emma let go of the napkin, her shoulders straightening. Jake gave me a quick, hopeful glance before stepping across the room. I pulled out chairs for them as everyone watched. My mother's breath caught, my father's jaw clenched. I placed each child's plate on the fine china, a pattern of holly and berries their little hands once could only dream of touching. The grandchildren rose and followed. Murmurs rippled around us like wind through bare trees. Emma slid into the seat next to me. Jake sat on my other side. I slipped an arm around each of them, my own shield. I looked up at my parents. Their forced composure cracked under my gaze. No one spoke for a moment. The grand display of dishes now seemed absurd without the two people it had been meant to exclude. I glanced down at Emma's face. She was smiling, but I saw the flicker of hurt beneath. Jake's knuckles whitened on the tablecloth. I leaned forward, voice soft but steady. "They belong here," I said. My mother's lips trembled. My father's eyes darted away. Around us, a cousin cleared her throat and began gathering stray napkins, the room's tension winding tighter. Aunt Karen swallowed, then reached over to lift a crystal glass. "To family," she said in a shaky voice, raising it just above the table's center. "Together." The glass rattled against her thumb before she set it down again, breath unsteady. I looked at my children, Emma's bright eyes shining back at me, Jake's small smile growing real. I placed my right hand over Emma's and my left over Jake's. "Together," I whispered. At that moment, Grandma, my mother, stepped forward. She hesitated, then gently laid a hand on Emma's shoulder. The warmth of her touch was overdue, but it resonated across the table. My father's gaze softened as he reached out, almost tentatively, toward Jake's hand. The gesture was small, but it crackled through the quiet like the first ember of a long dormant fire. No words were needed. The room held its breath, watching as the two smallest members of our family took their place among us. And in that hush, I felt something shift, the weight of old slights lifting, if only for a moment. But I also knew the work wasn't done. Tradition could be rewritten, but only if they remembered this night. I straightened in my seat, shoulders back, eyes fixed on the place settings now shared by every generation at once. And as the first real conversation, tentative, apologetic, hopeful, began to bloom around us, I realized this silent, deliberate act of inclusion was only the beginning. What came next would define us all. The first snowfall of the season dusted my front steps like a promise as I unlocked the door to my own house, this time on my turf, beneath my roof in South Minneapolis. I could smell pine boughs and cinnamon simmering on the stove, hear laughter drifting from the kitchen where my husband and kids wrestled with string lights. Weeks had passed since the showdown at my parents', and tonight was more than a party. It was a chance to write a new holiday story. I stepped inside, brushing snow from my boots, and surveyed the scene. One long oak table stretching from the living room archway to the bay window, draped in a simple white runner, mismatched chairs surrounding it like old friends. Hand-painted ornaments swung from a narrow garland overhead. My children's homemade place cards, tiny snowflakes cut from cardstock, marked every seat, no exceptions. Emma slipped around me, hugging my waist. "Mom," she whispered, "it's perfect." Jake bounced beside her, eyes shining with excitement. I ruffled his hair, heart full. Tonight no one would be an afterthought. My parents arrived first, coats in hand. My mother's cheeks were rosy, her eyes cautious but warm. My father lingered on the threshold, looking at the eager faces of grandchildren and cousins I'd invited from every corner of our lives. Neighbors, friends, even the new couple from across the street. "Laura," my mother said softly, voice cracking with a tremor I recognized as humility. "Thank you for doing this." She glanced at the table, then met my gaze. "I see it now." My father shifted beside her, folding his hands behind his back, and managed a small nod. "Oh, folding tables," he murmured, and even his attempt at a joke sounded sincere. The trickle of family grew steady. My sister and her partner, giggling as they wrestled an oversized wreath, Aunt Karen carrying a tray of spiced nuts, Uncle Greg teasing my husband about taking over the holiday gig. No guarded glances, no secret corners. Everyone slipped into place around that table, linked by stories waiting to be shared. I stood at the head, Emma and Jake at either side. My husband poured mugs of hot cider, steam swirling like the breath of Christmas magic. I inhaled deeply, feeling the warmth spread through the room as winter winds rattled the windows. My mother finally found her voice. "This is what I always dreamed family would feel like," she said, eyes glistening. "Thank you for teaching us how." My father cleared his throat. "To family," he said, raising his mug. "Together." The clink of cider glasses was soft but firm, quiet pledge echoing in the lamplit room. I lifted my own mug, heart brimming. "To family, together," I repeated, letting the words settle in every corner of my home and my heart. We sipped and laughed, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and honey-glazed ham, dipping buttered rolls and stirring gravy. Emma told a story about a snowball fight that ended with marshmallows in her hair. Jake corrected his cousin on the best way to string popcorn. The chatter rose, a gentle tide of voices, weaving new memories over the old floorboards. Later, as carols played softly and candles flickered on the windowsill, I caught my parents watching my children. My mother offered Emma a second slice of gingerbread. My father handed Jake a miniature sled he'd carved in his workshop. I realized this scene, no hierarchy, no hidden tables, felt more sacred than any tradition I'd ever known. Still, as I watched their tentative smiles, I knew our work wasn't finished. Old patterns had deep roots. Next year, the question would return: whose needs would we honor? Would we remember the lesson, or would complacency creep in like ivy? I set down my mug and stood, clearing my throat. The room quieted and every pair of eyes settled on me. My father and mother sat side by side, cousins leaned forward, even my kids grew still. "Thank you," I said, voice steady, for being here, for being family. May we always find room for everyone at this table, no matter what traditions tell us. I paused, letting the weight of that promise hang in the air. They nodded, smiles blossoming. I looked around the table, at faces bright with cider warmth, at the simple runner stretching between us, and felt a quiet hope settle in my chest. Because this was more than Christmas dinner. It was a new legacy. And as snowflakes tapped against the window panes, I realized that as long as we remembered tonight, our family would never let anyone sit alone again.